In today's video, we're revisiting the Sony A7S III and why it's still one of the most powerful cameras on the market, even in 2024. Now, the great news is in March of 2024, there's an expected new firmware upgrade coming to this camera, which gives us DCI 4K. It also allows us now to shoot in true 24p or 24 Hertz. So that's a great update for people who need it. This is still an absolute powerhouse, and it's easy to get distracted with all the new Sony camera releases, but you come back to the Sony A7S III and you realize just how great it is, even in 2024. Let's get into it. How I ended up with the Sony A7S III was simple. I loved what I was getting out of the FX3 and I thought I could use a B camera. And I kind of almost bought into the hype of the A7 IV, not too early, but I waited and I thought, yeah, I don't want to spend the same sort of money again on this, and the FX30 wasn't out at the time either. So I thought, what else is there? I bought an A7 IV, it overheated twice in 10 minutes. It overheated twice in 10 minutes, and that's with the thermals set to high. Now, I live in Australia and get up to 40 degrees Celsius where I live, not every day or anything like that, but just shooting outside, it was completely unusable, and the rolling shutter was noticeably worse than this. Now, it's a great camera if you're on a tripod in the studio or if you're a photographer, but I just thought I can't live with the A7 IV. There's too many compromises with the crops and all that kind of stuff, and the overheating was a huge deal breaker. I ended up taking the A7 IV back for an A7S III and I paid the difference and I couldn't be happier. The A7S III has done everything that the Sony FX3 can do, except we get a killer electronic viewfinder. It's arguably the best electronic viewfinder you're going to find. It looks absolutely stunning. And still, even to this day, with all the other cameras I've reviewed on the channel, none have come close to this. It just looks amazing. Furthermore, the A7S III has never overheated on me once, and I shot with both of these cameras, the FX3 and the A7S III, around the entirety of the state of Florida, and I've shot outside here in Australia in summer, and it just continues to work. So it's very reliable. Heat management shouldn't be an issue on cameras in 2024 or 2023 or even the year before that, but people seem to put up with it based on a price differential. I don't think this is justified. Just because something is smaller doesn't make it better. I want a camera that I can use in any scenario and still get great results and have it operational throughout the entire shoot. Spending about 10 grand on a trip to go overseas, one of the things that I needed was redundancy. The A7S III, like the FX3 and many other cameras from Sony, have dual SD card slots. And I had an SD card fail me on a shoot we did in Melbourne, Florida, which isn't Melbourne, Australia, but Melbourne, Florida. So those kind of things can just save the day, and it's a massive benefit if you're doing any type of professional work. If you plan on doing something important like a wedding or anything where you can't afford to lose any of the footage, the A7S III still ticks that box. When it comes to handling and ergonomics, the A7S III is easily as good as the FX3. While the body's slightly bigger because of that EVF, we save ourselves some time and effort by not having to dive through custom settings digitally. We can do everything thanks to the top dial on the top. It's a more conventional camera in that sense, very similar to something like the Panasonic S5 Mark II, for example. Everything's just on a top dial. I love the fact that the top dial won't accidentally get bumped. There's a little locking mechanism on it as well, which is fantastic. We get the exposure compensation dial right next to it, which we can also lock. I love these features. It just means that you can change settings on the fly very quickly without having to hit the menu button, cycle through stuff on the camera menu to do exactly the same thing. So the A7S III is actually a better camera to use, in my opinion, than the FX3. If you know the channel, you know how much I love using S&Q mode on cameras because it saves you a lot of time, both when you're shooting the footage and also in editing. So the great thing about the A7S III, I can shoot 2 seconds in S&Q and get 8 seconds back after the fact. And this is awesome. If you're shooting product B-roll, for example, like I was doing in Florida, you can use this camera for 2 or 3 second bursts and have lots of B-roll coverage. And that was the primary reason why I used this camera. Even shooting at 4K at 120 frames per second in the US, I had no problems with overheating whatsoever. It just continued to work. And while we are getting some firmware upgrades for the Sony A7S III in March of 2024, some of the things that we'll never get to this camera is some of the AI tracking. It doesn't have that chip. It also won't give us the active dynamic steady shot, which essentially sort of crops in digitally and then stabilizes it much like a GoPro does. And we won't also get the framing mode as well, which tracks you as you move in and out. Now, you can do all of this stuff in post-production if you know your editing suite, but it's a handy tool to have, and it's something that kind of interests me to some extent. If it came to a camera that didn't overheat or had any of those problems, I would be very interested, but it's definitely not something that would be a deal maker or breaker for me. I think the biggest ding against the A7S III, much like the FX3 and FX30, is the fact that the IBIS isn't great. If you're doing a lot of handheld work, I have to run so much of it through Catalyst Browse to stabilize it. It's not that big of a problem if you're just standing there shooting handheld like this, it's fine. But once you start moving the camera around, it takes a while for the IBIS to really catch up and then do its thing, which isn't great. So if you're going to be doing a lot of handheld work, it's kind of a hard camera to recommend for, say, vloggers or whatever in 2024, because there's much better options out there, but it still does a really great job otherwise. Now, when it comes to its stabilization, this is about the best you can get. Now, I'm holding this on a tripod that's weighted down, so it's enhancing the stabilization, but this is about as good as it can get, and it does a pretty good job with the active steady shot on, but it's still nowhere near as good as some of the modes you will find in some of the new cameras. But you know what? This won't overheat. Now, the A7S III, while it's not the newest camera on the market, it's been out for nearly 4 years or whatever it is. I'm going to talk about how it compares up against the likes of the S5IIX from Panasonic. Now, as a filmmaker tool, this is a much better camera. We get high resolutions, we get open gate, all the video tools built directly into the camera, and better IBIS. So if you're a run and gun filmmaker and you're not going to be shooting at 4K 120 frames, then buy this. I think it's a really great buy, and it's also still cheaper than the A7S III. But if you plan on shooting 4K 60 a lot, like I am right now, or 4K at 120 frames per second, you can shoot basically uncropped in every mode with full autofocus. There's autofocus limitations on the S5IIX, so just keep that in mind. It works with phase detection autofocus in most modes, but not all modes, which is where the Sony gets the win. It's really easy to get sucked into the hype of the latest and greatest camera, especially when a lot of prominent YouTubers and content creators are switching to every new camera that comes out from Sony. I see it all the time, man. The same crew switching to camera, to camera, to camera. It's great for their content boost, and if the camera that they're switching to is cheaper, it appeals to a wider audience. It makes a lot of sense, but I think if you're going to invest in a camera, it needs to tick all the boxes for you. And for me, I can't live with one SD card slot. I can't live with the camera overheating. It's 30 degrees out here today. It's humid as, and I'm sweating big time. And I know this camera is going to work, and I tested it extensively throughout the state of Florida and outside in the heat of an Australian summer. So I know it's going to work, and I would have no problems recommending this camera even in 2024, not because I bought one, but because it's proved to be a really great choice for what I do in mixed shooting conditions. So whether you're in the studio or out in the field, you can hit record and know it's going to work. One of the things Sony doesn't get enough credit for is its color science. This was another reason why I ended up just going for a camera with the same sensor as the FX3. Color science out of this camera looks great. I'm using auto white balance right now, but anytime I white balance the camera manually, it looks great. I don't have to go in and do any modifications to the image. The skin tones look good, the color science looks great, and I have no complaints with this, and it holds its own still with the Panasonic S5IIX and many other newer cameras on the market. It's so easy to get a great image out of this. Even if you just put it all on auto, it's going to do a great job. Maybe one of its only limitations, other than the IBIS, is of course the fact that the auto exposure isn't great. It can sort of fluctuate on a dime. It's probably doing this throughout the video as the light changes here with this super wide angle lens. But generally speaking though, I have no complaints with the color science. I still think it's one of the best I've seen from any camera, and also on other channels when I watch other creators. There's three things that this sensor is known for that you won't find on a lot of other cameras. Low rolling shutter, which is awesome. That's where it gets wavy if you pan the camera left to right or you're doing any type of whip pans. This will just look a lot nicer and cleaner. Secondly, it's a great low light camera. I shot a short film using the Sony FX3, and this camera will do exactly the same job. So as you can see on screen, it does a great job when shooting in a low lit environment. And thirdly, this sensor is capable of exceptional dynamic range when shooting in S-Log3. There's no advantage to buying the FX3 over this, of course, when it comes to all of these features. They're identical in terms of their sensor. So if you want to save yourself some money, this is still a really great camera. And lastly, I'm glad finally that Sony are bringing a firmware upgrade to this particular camera. It's very late and a lot of people have jumped ship, but for those who haven't, like myself and many other channels that I know shoot with an A7S III, it's great to see that they're finally supporting this camera a lot more. Whether they bring out another one in this line, I don't know, and I kind of don't think they will. I think this might be the last of this particular line of cameras, but either way, it's a great camera even in 2024, and if this is the last firmware upgrade for it, I'm thankful that it's coming out and it will make it more in line with the Sony FX3. I just hope that the menu system matches the Sony FX3. That way we can have it like it was when we first bought it, matching cameras. That's what we want, a different form factor, but essentially the same thing. Anyway, thanks for watching. Let us know what you think of this update. I'll catch you on the next one. See ya.